The Symphony of Shadows. The silence before the note. The silence of Blackwater Cove was the first movement of Elara's masterpiece, and it was a composition she was failing to write. For 3 months, the city had been a symphony of noise that had culminated in a deafening crescendo of failure. The premiere of her chamber piece, Urban Fragments, had been met with a review that now played on a loop in her mind. Elara Vance offers technical competence but a profound emotional emptiness. One is left feeling nothing. The words were a sharper, more lasting wound than any boo or hiss. Her agent, a man whose optimism was as thin as his hair, had suggested a retreat. Get out of the city, Elara. Find some real silence. Let it speak to you. Blackwater Cove was more than silence, it was an auditory void. The stone lighthouse keeper's cottage, perched on a jagged fist of land thrust against the Atlantic, came with a month's rent paid in advance and a key left under a moss-covered rock. There was no welcome, no instructions. The village below was a smudge of grey slate roofs and smoking chimneys, huddled around a harbour where a handful of fishing boats slept on the tide. The air smelled of salt, rotting seaweed, and a profound, ancient stillness. The first hook, she had come to the edge of the world to find her voice, but the silence she sought felt less like an absence, and more like a presence waiting to speak. Her first foray into the village was an exercise in quiet rejection. The general store, a dim place that smelled of tar and dried fish, was run by a woman with eyes the color of flint. She took Elara's money for groceries with a wordless nod. The men mending nets on the docks fell silent as she passed, their conversations dying mid-sentence, their gazes not hostile, but heavy, like stones being placed on a grave. It was on her third evening, as a cold fog began to bleed from the sea, that she heard it. The sound was so faint it seemed to originate inside her own skull, a low, mournful melody, carried on a wind that shouldn't have been able to carry a whisper. It was a man's voice, deep and guttural, singing in a dialect that twisted familiar English syllables into something alien and sorrowful. She rushed to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass, but saw only the shifting, grey-white wall of fog. She opened her notebook, her hand trembling slightly. She had not felt the urge to compose in weeks. Now, her fingers itched for a pencil. She transcribed the few phrases she could grasp, the notes forming a strange, haunting scale. It was beautiful, in a way that made the fine hairs on her arms stand erect. The melody was a key, and something deep within her soul, a lock she never knew existed, began to turn. The lay of the deep dweller. The next day, she sought out the source. The flint-eyed woman at the store, whose name was Maeve, became a fortress of silence when asked about the singing. Fog plays tricks on the mind, she said, her tone final, her eyes darting towards an old, yellowed photograph of a fishing boat on the wall. It was down at the harbour that she found him. Old Man Hemlock was a landmark as permanent as the cliffs themselves. He sat on an overturned dinghy, his gnarled hands carving a piece of driftwood into a shape that was unsettlingly non-human. His face was a topography of wrinkles, and his eyes, when he looked up at her, were the color of the winter sea, a pale, merciless grey. "You're the one from the city," he stated. It wasn't a question. The composer. Word travelled fast in a place where nothing happened. "I heard singing last night," Elara said, her voice sounding too bright, too modern in the ancient air. "A beautiful melody. Do you know it?" Hemlock's carving stilled. "You heard the lay," Did you?" He looked past her, towards the horizon where the sea and sky merged into a single, leaden sheet. "The Lay of the Deep Dweller. It's an old song. Best left unsung." "But it's magnificent," Elara insisted, the composer in her overriding the instinctive fear. "The harmonic structure is unlike anything I've ever—" "It's not for you," he interrupted, his voice sharp as a shard of glass. "That music isn't for concert halls. It's a maintenance song. You don't play with it. You don't write it down." He looked at her sheet music notebook as if it were a loaded weapon. And in that moment, Elara understood the village's hostility. They weren't unfriendly, they were afraid. And she was the one carrying the spark towards their gunpowder. But the seed was planted. The Lay of the Deep Dweller became an obsession. She started staying up late, her high-fidelity recorder pointed towards the sea, capturing the fragments that drifted on the fog. She learned that different people sang different songs. There was the storm singer's lament, a frantic, rhythmic chant that seemed to coil and strike like a serpent, sung only when the sky turned bruise-purple. There was the tide-turner's dirge, a slow, pulsing rhythm that mirrored the pull of the moon, often hummed by the women as they hung washing. Nights became a feverish ritual of transcription. She covered the walls of the cottage's main room with her sheet music, the staves and notes creating a sprawling, chaotic map. And as the map grew, a terrifying, magnificent picture emerged. They weren't separate songs. They were movements. Movements of a single, terrifying symphony. The conductor's obsession. Elara stopped sleeping. Food lost its taste. The real world, the world of emails, her agent's check-ins, the memory of her failed career faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. The only reality was the symphony. She discovered the connections. A dissonant chord from the lay resolved not in its own movement, but in the shrieking climax of the storm singer's lament. The bass line of the tide-turner's dirge was the metronome, the steady, dreadful pulse underlying everything. The music was a complex, interlocking mechanism. It was a lock. And it was missing its key. The final movement. A frantic energy possessed her. It was no longer about transcribing, it was about composing. The existing themes demanded resolution. They cried out for a finale. She felt like a conduit, the music flowing through her from a source that was not her own imagination. She would wake at her desk, her hand cramping around a pencil, having filled pages with a complex, atonal score in her sleep. The cottage was no longer a retreat, it had become the instrument, and she was merely the string being plucked by an unseen, colossal hand. The physical world began to reflect the corruption of the score. The air in the cottage grew perpetually cold and damp, smelling strongly of the deep ocean, a briny, metallic tang. The windows would frost over from the inside on mild nights, the frost forming patterns that resembled strange, spiraling shells and the unblinking eyes of deep-sea fish. She started hearing the hum, a low, resonant frequency that was felt in the bones more than heard by the ears. It was a bass note so profound it seemed to vibrate up from the very bedrock beneath the cottage. One afternoon, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere, she walked along the cliff path. The sea was calm, but the water had a strange, oily, prismatic sheen. A dead squid, larger than any she had ever seen, with tentacles covered in bioluminescent suckers that still flickered with a sickly green light, had washed ashore. Its body was twisted into an impossible knot. She looked down at the village. A group of children were playing in a circle, but their game was silent, their movements stiff and ritualistic. They were acting out the pulling of a rope, their faces blank. It looked less like play and more like rehearsal. She had come here to write music, but now the whole world was becoming a perverse and terrifying score, and every living thing was a note waiting to be played. The crack in the score. The confrontation with Old Man Hemlock was inevitable. She found him at the harbour, mending a net with practiced, weary movements. She didn't speak. She simply held out her master score, the dozens of pages filled with the sprawling, completed symphony. He didn't need to read music. He recognized the shape of the curse. His face, already ancient, seemed to collapse in on itself. The little color he had drained away, leaving him the gray of a corpse. "What have you done?" he whispered, the words a dry rustle. "Child, what have you done?" "Tell me what it is," Elara demanded, her voice raw from lack of sleep and terror. "What is the deep dweller?" "It is the shadow in the water," Hemlock said, his eyes glazed with a centuries-old fear. "The sleeper in the trench. It was here before the first fish swam. My ancestors, they didn't worship it. You don't worship a storm. You survive it. They made a pact. They learned the songs to keep it sleeping, to keep its dreams from boiling the sea and pulling down the sky." He pointed a trembling finger at her score. "We sing the pieces separately. The whole song, the complete symphony, is the summoning. The final movement is the command to rise. For generations, we have been the chorus, singing the lullaby, and you have just written the alarm clock." "But it wasn't complete," Elara cried, a sob tearing at her throat. I finished it. I gave it a finale." "You composed the last note," Hemlock said, his voice hollow. "The note of waking. The bind is broken." As if on cue, the deep, subaudible hum that had been the cottage's background noise intensified. It was no longer a hum, but a vibration that shook the very stones of the jetty. The water in the harbour, placid a moment before, began to shudder, not in waves, but in a frantic, circular jitter, as if being vibrated by a colossal tuning fork. From the village, a bell began to toll, a single, desperate, iron note. It was not a call to prayer, but a signal of surrender. The final rehearsal was over. The performance was about to begin. The final cadence. The villagers emerged from their cottages. They were not panicking. They moved with a grim, resigned purpose, gathering on the high cliff overlooking the sea. They were not carrying weapons. They were forming a choir. Hemlock grabbed Elara's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "There's nothing to be done now. You will watch. You composed this. You will see it performed." He pulled her towards the cliff edge. The humming was now a physical pressure, a wall of sound that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. The sea was receding, pulling back from the bay in a way that defied all natural law. It wasn't a wave pulling out, it was the ocean being sucked down a cosmic drain, exposing vast, glistening stretches of seabed littered with the wrecks of galleons and trawlers, and the bleached, immense bones of creatures that had no name. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with a sudden, profound eclipse of the sun, as if a great shadow were falling over the world. The villagers began to chant. It was not the lay, or the lament, or the dirge. It was a single, guttural word, repeated over and over, a word that was the linguistic equivalent of the final, resolving chord in her symphony. It was the name. They were singing the thing's name. And the sea answered. A mile out, the water bulged. It was not a wave, but the ocean itself giving birth. The surface tension broke, and a shape began to rise. It was not a whale, nor a squid, nor anything that belonged to the sane, ordered tree of life. It was a mass of shifting, liquid darkness, a silhouette that hurt the mind to look upon. It was vast beyond comprehension, its emergence causing the very horizon to curve. Tentacles of pure shadow, lined with galaxies of cold, phosphorescent light, slithered from the water, each one the size of a mountain range. At its center was not a face, but a vortex, a spiraling emptiness that promised the unmaking of all things. This was the deep dweller. This was the conductor of the Symphony of Shadows, and her masterpiece had been its summons. The psychic shriek that emanated from it was the ultimate crescendo. It was a sound that dissolved thought, that unraveled hope, that was the very essence of oblivion. Elara fell to her knees, her hands clamped over her ears, but the sound was inside her, tearing apart the very composition of her soul. The villagers' chanting turned to unified, final screams that were swallowed by the entity's presence. The shadow tentacles swept over the cliffs, not with physical force, but with a wave of absolute cold and silence. Where they passed, people didn't die, they became, their forms dissolving into motes of dust that were then scattered into the nothingness. Elara, alone in the lighthouse cottage, was spared the first touch. She watched through the window as the world ended. The sheet music for her magnum opus fluttered in the unnatural gale, the pages dancing a final, macabre ballet. She saw the final page, the one containing the last, triumphant note she had composed. The note that had broken the world. She was not a composer who had found inspiration. She was the soloist who had played the opening note of the world's requiem. The Symphony of Shadows was complete. The entity rose, blotting out the sky, its shadow falling over the entire coast and reaching inland. The final, devastating silence of the human race, a silence soon to be absolute and eternal, was its ultimate, terrifying resolution. And in the heart of the silence, Elara Vance, the artist who had given everything for her work, finally understood what it meant to feel something. It was the crushing, infinite weight of being the last audience to a performance that would never, ever end.